In this presentation, we're going to review the idea of the rise of the West. The idea of the rise of the West is a storyline and a rationale that has been created by historians to explain why the modern world seems to be defined by European features. So what's a rationale? A rationale is an explanation. A story is just a narrative that begins with some explanation or exposition and then has a period of conflict that includes rising action, has a climax where everything comes together, and then falling action until you get to a resolution. Historians tell stories. The story that we're interested in today is called The Rise of the West. So we have to ask ourselves, what is the question, what is the West? Well, if you look at this map, the West is essentially all of the territories in green. That is the first world, or the developed world, the world which is rich and industrialized. Since about 1600 AD, historians have been asking themselves this question: why is the West so successful? These countries that were defined in the map that you saw on the last slide have become wealthy and powerful, and the question is, why? Whenever we hear a story, it's important for us to introduce ourselves to the storytellers. Here are two important storytellers. The one on the left is Samuel P. Huntington, and the one on the right is Leopold von Ranke. Both of them are important historians. Historians like Huntington and von Ranke have told us a story of the West becoming powerful and wealthy that begins with the Reconquista in Spain. This is a time in the late 1400s in which the Spanish retook the Anatolian Peninsula, or Spain, from Muslim rule. That story continues with the success of explorers like Christopher Columbus and the success of the conquistadors who took control of most of North and South America, and also brought with them, although they didn't know it, a disease that wiped out between 70 and 90% of the Native American population. For many historians, the next stage of the story of the success of the West has been the development of democracy. They claim that democracy developed nowhere else but in the West. The next step in this story is the development of capitalism and industrialization, which created the possibility for what we call democratic processes, but capitalist money markets and powerful industrial manufacturing of goods and services. Then the story goes with democracy and knowledge of the world, with trade, and with the success in capitalism and industrialization. The West had the ability to control most of the rest of the world. In this map, you see the colored states are controlled by European or outlying European powers, such as the United States. The story often ends with an explanation of the power of Western technology, which historians claim is a result of all of these developments. The question remains, however, how did the West become the place where all of this came together? According to the story of the rise of the West, a story that historians have been telling us for about 400 years, the first answer to this question was that Westerners were just better. Europeans were just better, primarily because of their Christian religion. When the argument that Christianity had blessed Westerners with power, success, and intelligence no longer seemed to explain many of the problems that they needed to answer, historians began to argue that the superiority of Western civilization came from its connection to Greek heritage and the critical thinking and democratic processes in places like Athens. During the French Revolution and after, Europeans claimed that Western supremacy was based on progress and the idea that only the West had a history that was constantly changing and moving forward. Eventually, the idea of the rise of the West was also supported by Milton Friedman and other capitalist economists who saw industrial development as progress and saw the West as the exclusive place where industrial development occurred. Even Western theorists who seem to speak against capitalism, for example, Karl Marx, Friedrich Engels, saw progress and history, Western history, as inevitable progress, as the key to understanding the rise of the West and the success of the West as a dominant cultural force in the world. And in fact, the idea of the rise of the West came full circle. Max Weber theorized that it was Western Protestant Christianity that brought a work ethic into Western culture that didn't exist in any other culture in the world. Of course, this was a very narrow view that didn't take into account the cultural developments and the work ethics of other non-Western cultures. But this was another bit of evidence that was used to support the idea of the rise of the West. Ultimately, the rise of the West has one key problem, and that is that it doesn't explain well one of the things that we're going to look at in this class. That is that there is a gap between the wealthiest countries and the least wealthy countries in the world, and that Western ideas don't seem to be able to solve the problem of that wealth gap. Western ideas of Western superiority and the rise of the West have suggested that if states find themselves to be poor and not developing, they should adopt Western ideas and eventually they will become less poor. That's what's known as the diffusionist theory of modernization. However, that diffusionist theory does not seem to be working in the way that rise of the West theorists have predicted. And so the continuing gap between developed and non-developed countries suggests that the rise of the West theory may not be correct.